Hi, so this is Dr. Kelly Watson, and I'm here on this video to talk about my ideas for how to design an effective class. It starts really with how to design an effective course, and all of the classes need to roll up into that framework. So what I wanted to share to begin with is a rubric from an assessment or a course called Quality Matters. And Quality Matters is a course that I took when uh, when we first started teaching online, or we first started to contemplate teaching online. And this is important because what they were teaching us in that course actually applies to all course design. And so it was a real eye-opener for me. Of course, at the time, it was like 2019. I thought I was going to be one of the first to be out there teaching online, and I was really excited about it. Turns out that then the pandemic happened, and now everyone's teaching online. But I think that a lot of folks ended up teaching online by default because of the pandemic. And so what they did was take what they did in the classroom and sort of try to apply it online. But this course actually really taught me some of the fundamentals. And I think it's really pertinent here when you think about course design, or when you think about class design, how to roll it up under the whole course. So this is essentially a rubric for higher ed for what are all the components that you need to think about when you're doing course design. So it starts with an overview. This may seem obvious, but it's not always included, unfortunately, in how people design. But, when you're in the online environment, especially, you don't always get an orientation from an in-person, engagement. So it's important to explain how to get started. And so oftentimes you'll see in online courses a big button that says start here. And that's a really great way to show students that no matter what else is happening, here's how we get started. Important to orient learners to the purpose and structure of the course, how it's going to go. We often do this in the syllabus. So a lot of these components get included in the syllabus. And, you have to ask yourself as a student, how often do you read the syllabus in detail? I know I didn't as a student until I had taken this course and then realized how much orientation happens in the syllabus and how important it is. So communicating the expectations for how the course is going to go, what are the components of the course, what are the institutional policies that the learner is expected to comply with, what technology requirements are going to be involved in the course, and what are the minimum level of computer skills and digital literacy skills that are going to be involved. Obviously important online, but increasingly we're using a lot more technology in the in-person classroom as well. And so it's important to orient the students to what our expectations are. If you struggle to use Excel, for example, and we're going to be doing a lot of Excel modeling, it's important to lay that out, because you may have students, then require some kind of remedial work before they can actually take your course. And that's important to establish up front of what extra work they're going to need to do. So all of these, you can see the points that are applied in this rubric. So as you're doing course design, you can think about the points as a weight of importance or a weight of priority, as something to think about. And I have posted this in Brightspace. So secondly are this concept of learning objectives or competencies. And this really is, what is this course designed to do? What are we hoping the learner gets out of this course? Really, really important, and yet a component that people don't often think about. They sort of jump in and say, well, I'm going to throw this splatter of activities and these fun things that I've seen before. But if you don't tie it back to the actual learning objectives or competencies you're hoping to get, then you're going to be all over the place. And you've probably attended some corporate training that seemed like a mess, seemed like it was everywhere. And the reason is often because they haven't actually sat down and thought about, what are the competencies? What are the outcomes? What are we hoping to get out of this? Now, as a side note, we want to think about also the Bloom's taxonomy in this context. And I'll talk about the Bloom's taxonomy in a little bit. But you want to make sure that the learning objectives of the course actually align to the level of the learner. So, for example, if you expect learners to just memorize and parrot back some facts, which is a really low level of learning, really, when we think about the Bloom's taxonomy, your activities are going to be aligned with getting them to memorize things. And in fact, it's going to be tied at the end to how you assess learning, and you're going to be assessing at a very, parrot back type of a mentality. But if you're hoping that the students get a much higher level, like you're hoping they take the information in this course and either apply it to their work context or even better, synthesize new outcomes from the material, well, then you're going to make sure that your activities are designed at that high level to get them thinking. And that means it's going to assume a whole bunch of existing knowledge, maybe that they already have. So you're not going to waste time in your course at lower levels if you're expecting higher level outcomes. Otherwise, there's going to be a real disconnect. They're going to exit the course. And often we see this too, where then they're going to get a little quiz, which really parrots back memorization. And it is really unsatisfying from a learner outcome perspective. So the learning objectives and competencies, really, really important. We need to start there when we're designing. And it's not just for the course, but as you'll see in a moment, it really is for every single activity in the course to make sure that they're aligned to those learning objectives. Big part of the rubric here. And so that then leads us to assessment and measurement. How are you going to tell that your learners achieve these learning outcomes? Really, really important, because again, just because somebody memorizes a bunch of facts doesn't mean they can actually apply this knowledge and take it to work. We see this so often in corporate training where, people, again, a lot of corporate design is not done well and not done, with this sort of structure behind it. And so we have very unclear learning objectives. And then when you are asked to assess and measure whether people were successful, oftentimes it ends up being, well, did they have fun? Did they like it? Was it edutainment enough? And that's really not effective from a learning perspective. Then you want to think about what are the instructional materials that are going to contribute to the achievement of these learning objectives. And really, I actually reverse this. And for me, it's what activities and learner interaction, because I actually build all of my courses around interaction and more experiential learning, because again, in the corporate workspace, we generally hope that our learning outcomes have to do with behavior change. Or even synthesis, so synthesizing new ideas from the information that's been presented. So for me, the learning activities are what we center everything around. That's sort of the next piece, is how are we going to facilitate the learning? And what we know about adult learners is that they really need to be hands-on. And then that dictates what are the instructional materials that are going to need to be used. Are we going to need some technology tools, like I talked about earlier? Are we going to need some classroom materials? And what can they expect? Importantly also, you don't want to spring upon the learner that they're expected to provide some of these instructional materials or bring case studies to class or things like that without giving them some heads up and some notice. Most of the time, adult learners are very busy, have a lot of other things going on. So if you expect them to have done some previous work or are bringing something to the classroom, then you need to outline that up front and make sure that it's part of your design and not just sort of an accidental, oh, oops, can you do this? All right, we talked about technology. What is the technology that's going to be used? And importantly, do we have to have some kind of assumption of previous knowledge in order to use the technology? So if you're going to bring out a new program that nobody's used, that's great, as long as you plan to have an activity that gets them up to speed on it. But if it's a technology that you just assume they know how to use, then make sure that that is expressed and that they indeed can use that technology. And then, of course, there's protecting data and privacy. So oftentimes we will embed surveys or interactive mini assessments along the way in our courses. And so we have to always be mindful of protecting that data, being very clear about who's going to have access to that. In our case, we want to make sure that if we're providing feedback information or even personal information to our facilitators so that they know who's in the room and who might need extra coaching for something, that we make sure that our facilitators are also very well versed in that data protection and privacy. You can't assume that just because you give information to someone that they're going to protect it with the same, rigor that you will. And there's actually a lot of laws around protecting the data and privacy of learners. FERPA comes to mind here, and we'll talk about FERPA at another time, but you want to make sure, you for example, cannot share information about one learner in a higher ed environment with other learners. So I don't know if you remember back in school when people would, throw all your test papers on a stack and have people root through and get their own. Well, in that process, they can see what other students' grades are, and that's a no-no. You cannot do that anymore. And you also can't put up something on the board that says this person got the highest score, or things like that. You can certainly put a range of grades up so that people can orient themselves to how well they did, but you cannot discuss any other student or identify any student anywhere. So just things to know about data and privacy, really, really important to communicate that that's the case. All right, then we have learner support. So these are, informing the students up front, how they can get technical support. I use McGraw-Hill for a lot of my students. It's an online textbook, or it's their textbooks in an online environment. And oftentimes students struggle, even seniors, with that technology, or sometimes, glitches happen. So I don't want to be spending my instructor time, my valuable time, doing tech support for students. So I make sure that I share with them the McGraw-Hill 1-800 number, how to obtain support, the ITS information at LMU, and I direct them to the right place. And this is especially the case if I'm using a technology that they're not using in any other courses, then it needs to be really clear how to get support. One thing you may find about, college students is that they do their homework about 15 minutes before it's due. And if you make it due at midnight, that means it's quite late at night. They also pull all-nighters and things like that. So as an instructor, if you don't want to be the person who's giving them support at 11 o'clock at night, then you want to provide those resources to them. And then finally, there's this accessibility and usability. And this is really important because not all of your learners have the same level of ability in terms of their ability to access. So this really relates to things like people who are maybe visually impaired, and so thus need an oral recording of things that you're providing visually. And by the same token, folks may be visually fine but can't hear, so you want to make sure you have subtext for your videos if possible, or any other course materials. So I have a separate video on universal design, but this is part of that, is just making sure that especially if you have learners that have difficulties in any of those places, that you want to make sure that your formats are meeting, those needs and can, provide equal access for everybody to the learning. You don't want to have some disability be holding somebody back from actually learning in your classroom. The other thing to be mindful of when you are doing course design is that everybody learns differently, and some people are visual learners, and some people are audio learners, and some people are tactile learners. And so having a nice mix of formats is really, really important, because then you're not leaning your course design towards one type of individual. You're trying to make sure that, everybody has an opportunity to learn, and there may be multiple ways to kind of get the same information across. And that's really important, because not everybody's going to, respond to your visual PowerPoint or something like that. This is one of the reasons that I do so much experiential stuff, because I have an opportunity and experience to provide the tactile, provide audio, because we're talking through what they're doing, and also visual all at the same time. And so everybody in the room has a different way of hearing the same information, or seeing the same information, or feeling the same information. And that tends to be the most efficient way, in my experience, from doing that. So this is the QM rubric. It's a great checklist as you're doing course design, to just make sure that you have provided all of these aspects, or at least thought about these aspects as you're doing your design. All right, I'm going to stop sharing that, because the next thing I want to talk about is how I specifically do design in my courses. So it starts for me with just a basic template to outline. and I'm sharing that now. So essentially, and this is really just very, very basic, but it helps me and my designers to make sure that we're framing the training in a way that that thinks through these ties between the learning objective for the course, the learning objective for the activity, and then how you assure that that learning has happened and assess the learning at the end of the course. So, possible course titles, I tend to do that last, but I put, it's up here on my course outline. Here are the course learning objectives, and I really consult with my clients to see what it is they reasonably hope to achieve here. And I'm very careful to be realistic, because sometimes you can have very vague learning objectives. And a great question, if somebody says, well, they're going to communicate better, is to help them narrow down, what does better communication look like? How do you know that they're communicating better? What kinds of behaviors would indicate this? And I really try to, this is an area of intense consultation with clients to make sure that these are not vague. So go back through some of the syllabi that you've experienced in your life and think about, are those objectives really sort of, hey, we're going to solve world hunger here? Or are those learning objectives specific enough that you can tell at the end of the course, yeah, I actually did achieve that. I actually did learn that. And self-report is part of it. So, we don't always just want to ask the learner, did you learn this? Because sometimes the learner is not a good witness to that information, as crazy as that sounds. But sometimes the learner doesn't realize what they've learned until we see it in a behavior down the road, or it comes back in the future as they process and maybe meld that information with other information that they've learned. And then they realize, oh my gosh, yes, I remember Professor Watson said that, or I learned that in Professor Watson's class. So you do want to be careful here about how much self-reporting happens, but you also want to make sure that, objectively speaking, if you were to look at these objectives at the end, did your learners learn that? And so I always want to make sure I take on achievable things, things I know I can test and reasonably expect to get done out of the session. Now, it also depends on the length of the course. So this outline can apply to a course that has multiple sessions, but you can also use this outline if you're just doing a single session. Now, we tell our clients, do not do a single session. One and dones are not very effective from a learning perspective. But that said, we have plenty of clients who insist that they're going to get one crack at this. And so, it provides us with a lot of design challenges and some concerns about whether or not, we can measure learning after a single session, but it happens, okay? All right, so you come up with, finally, you come up with some learning objectives that you think you're able to tackle, given the length of the course involved and how many sessions and things like that. Then you move on to designing each of the sessions. And so this just gives you an example of one session, but obviously you would repeat this for multiple sessions. So the session itself has to have learning objectives, and they need to be tied. So if you think about the overall course learning objectives, if the overall course learning objectives, let's say there's 5 things you're trying to do and you have 5 sessions, it actually dovetails nicely into, what are the learning objectives for this session? And you may at this point have an overarching learning objective, but here's also where you can get a little more specific about what it is if you were to break that down. So we want people to communicate better in this scenario in the workplace. Okay, so how am I going to break down communicate better into some sub-objectives? And again, we have to be able to measure them at the end. So, think of this as SMART goals. If you've done the SMART framework, they have to be specific and they have to be measurable, and, and the rest of the framework, of course. All right, so then what we tend to do, and this is, again, my bias and my way of doing things, but I start with, once I have the objectives and how I'm going to measure them, I think about the activities that I am going to bring to bear to work through this material and to make sure that at the end we're meeting the objectives. And so usually the final activity has some kind of bring it all together component to it. So it could be a big plenary discussion. It could be reflection, because don't forget, in order to have learning, you always have to have reflection, right? No, whatever you're going to do is going to have a reflection. But at the end, we may have some kind of bring it all together in a plenary, have a discussion, or have some kind of thing that just, interleaves everything that you've done through to this final, outcome. So that's why I have written here already a session reflection, 30, 60, 90 action planning, because even if we only do a single session, we want to do some kind of takeaway that keeps them practicing. And then in my business, we have this accountability partner framework where we actually assign them to a partner from the session and have them practice together. Because if you think about it, when you send somebody out into the real world to practice something that they've learned in this session, if they are surrounded by folks who haven't taken the training, they're going to be nudged back into older behaviors or whatever, because they don't have people who've learned this before. So by giving someone an accountability partner, they can go out and practice and then continue to come together and debrief with someone who's been in the session and who knows the information. And that way they can nudge each other through and reset and then go out and practice again. So we do it between sessions, and then we do it if we at the end as well of all of the sessions, to make sure they have a continued framework for practice. And we often switch up the accountability partners. If we have multiple sessions, you get a different one between each session. So there's the added component of networking across your organization, meeting new people, and cementing in some of those connections that are really important. But I digress. Okay, so that's usually my summary one. And so you've got to think about, in that summary last activity, whatever it is that brings it all together, and it may be they come together and synthesize like a new project or something that they're going to go apply in the workforce. All of that's great. So start there, but then you've got to back up. What are the pieces that these learners are going to need to get to that thing that I'm trying to achieve at the combination? So that's where I would then sketch out, okay, well, I'm going to do this activity, I'm going to do that activity, I'm going to do that activity, and then I see how all the pieces come together. And then you wonder, okay, well, when do they learn new content? Okay, well, generally, so usually my first activity is an icebreaker of some kind. We're also going to discuss, we're going to set the rules of engagement for the training. So we're going to do a session on psychological safety, because a lot of the work I do is workplace, and there's all kinds of danger and and problems. It's problematic to be practicing in an environment where it's actually really important for your career. So we try to establish some ground rules early. Oftentimes our learners come together and they don't know each other because it's people from different departments. And so we will make sure that they have an opportunity to break the ice, and then understand that they're going to protect each other and protect this safe space where they can practice and learn and make mistakes, and that's not going to be held against them for the rest of their lives and, derail their careers over it because somebody made an oops. So that's how I tend to start. Sometimes it's plenary. This was just, this is the start of something I was showing a client. So we were talking about specifically a plenary, but it could be an icebreaker, it could be, whatever. So where does the content come in? Well, generally, if I'm going to do an activity such as a case study or a breakout, I'm going to have a little content bridge. So something where the facilitator, shoots out a concept and says, okay, so this is what we know about effective listening skills. And so we'll bring something in from the literature or something in a model, and we will show them, here's a listening skills model. Then we're going to send them out and have them apply some of what they've learned in that content bridge. And then we're going to come back out and we're going to have a debrief of some kind, always a debrief. And we're going to connect that back to the content. So there's always going to be this, here's what we wanted you to do, you went in this breakout, and here's how that connects back to the content. And then here's how this connects back to the session learning objective that we have achieved because of this activity. So you see, the activity has to have a learning objective that makes sense for the session, that makes sense for the course. So this is how it's all tied together. And this is how you get away from just throwing in a random thing that you thought was fun, at some corporate training, but it's irrelevant. It's a waste of time. And we don't often have a lot of class time with adult learners, whether it's in a program like the DBA, or whether it's, in a training session. So you can't waste their time. it's really critical to not waste their time. So even though an activity may seem like it's really fun, if it doesn't have a learning objective that connects back and that you can actually assess later, it's a waste of time. Take it out of your trainings, okay? Even if it's fun. Now, fun and connection, social connection, and networking as part of the training are absolutely overarching objectives of what you're trying to do, but they're there to facilitate the learning of the content, not just in and of themselves. So make sure that they're always interwoven back to what these learning objectives need to be. Okay. And then at the end, after all of this in every single session, we are going to have some kind of assurance of learning, whether it be, a test of some kind. Sometimes we have clients that insist on having a test or a quiz or a survey or something, but it could also be some kind of deliverable that they take back into the workplace. And that's a nice way to bridge it back into applicability for their daily lives. So you can do lots of interesting things like that. Okay, I'm going to show you now, let me exit out of this, and I'm going to show you an actual course outline that I did for a client. Here we go. And this was right before we started to actually design the learning materials. So before we went to the PowerPoints and the games and everything else, we did this outline. So this was the last thing that we shared with the client before we converted it, just to get their buy-in and make sure that this is what they want to achieve. So this was a week-long course that I designed last year for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Department. And they had some objectives for this academy where they wanted to improve they wanted to bring stakeholders into the design process earlier in the process, before they designed something and then had to go back to the community, and then they would get pushback. So they were a bunch of scientists who were, really knowledgeable, and definitely felt that their approach to the community had become pushed outward. Like we know this about this endangered species, and so we're going to tell you the way it's going to be. And they were in constant conflict with stakeholders because of that. So and we changed the word stakeholders to shareholders for the purpose of this, for lots of reasons, important reasons. But anyhow, so we have these overarching learning objectives, and you can see they're very specific. And if you look at the blooms, so this was identify, and identify was really important because they had often overlooked stakeholder partners that then they were railroading, and they didn't mean to be railroading, that's their words, but that they were excluding unintentionally. And so identifying was important. So identify is kind of at a lower level of blooms, but we did that in the first day, and then we moved up. So then we were creating a plan, which that was, something that they hoped to achieve by the last day. They were developing a foundation of trust and this was some internal as well as external partners. And then they were practicing. So they were practicing, and, we have some of the very specifics here. Again, this was in partnership with a client. So, would I have maybe even made it more specific potentially, but you've got to work with the client. So then we broke it down into days, because each day had sessions. And so we had Monday, here was a session activity, and we had all of these activities, and they were a combination of using their folks across different departments to come and do. So we had guest speakers, a keynote address, and things like that. But even the keynote address had an objective. And then we had, as I mentioned, that icebreaker activity. We had the breakout rooms. We played these games. But always a debrief, and always debrief questions, which we provided to the facilitators and the facilitator guide so that they could lead the activities. So then we had, power interest grid stuff, then the logistics of their lunch, how they did the problem definition in the afternoon, the objectives and the debrief. And then finally we get to the daily debrief. So we brought them all back into a plenary, and we had a debrief in a massive plenary. So even if we had in fact, we had, I think, 8 or 10 breakouts for this, we always came back to the central session. So then we went on to Tuesday. And believe it or not, even though it's only overnight, really important part of the day is to go back in and talk about what happened the day before and make sure that, yes, you did debrief at the end of the day before, but you want to do it again, and then share the objectives of the next day. We achieved a lot in this. There was a lot of moving parts to this particular program. It was one of our biggest program devs ever. There were several hundred, I want to say 400 people attended this. It was a big deal. And lots of higher ups from Fish and Wildlife. So anyway, we go back, we get the debrief for the day, get to Wednesday. By Thursday, which is coming up here, yeah, by Thursday, we're starting to do a lot more. There's some case studies, but there's also a lot more building. So we started to build their projects. And then we got to a point where on Friday, they actually presented their products. They did a poster pitch. And then they had a leadership panel. Senior people came from Fish and Wildlife and walked through and looked at their posters. So it was really, really cool. So, but I wanted to share that with you so that you could see the actual details of what kind of thinking needs to go in behind the scenes before you start chucking together PowerPoints and thinking about activities and those materials and things like that. So, all right. Now, the next piece I want to talk about is this idea of assurance of learning, because especially in a corporate context, really, really important to make sure you're tied back to those learning objectives, but tough to do because adults don't like to take tests, right? And they don't like to think about that piece of it. And when you give them a survey at the end, we always have a survey link, half of them don't fill it out, and it becomes more, most companies who do training will probably just do a survey asking, did you like the training? And that's not really, what we're hoping to achieve. So let me share with you something else that's okay. And this is called the Kirkpatrick learning model, and it's about assessment of learning from this Kirkpatrick design. This is just from their website, so I'm not sharing anything that's proprietary or anything. But it thinks about assessing of learning or assuring learning at 4 different levels. The first one is that reaction. Did they like it? Was it engaging? Was it relevant to their jobs? This is that self-report stuff, I was talking about. And most training companies will only assess learning at this level. We were pushed by clients a couple of years ago to think beyond that. And that really opened my eyes to, we want to do more than just get a reaction. You want a good reaction, sure. Why? Because people feel woo-woo and they go back to work and they're woo-woo. And, there's some evidence that they'll, think about that in the future because it was woo-woo. But this doesn't tend to be a sticky way for learning to happen. It's just woo, they feel good. And then, in 6 months, they're back doing the same behavior. So the second level is learned. So here is that they acquired some knowledge, skills, attitude, and maybe improved their commitment based on their participation in the training. So, and this is the level that I think a lot of like sexual harassment training and maybe some knowledge skills-based stuff would happen, teach Excel training, would get you to this level of learning. So they acquired knowledge that they didn't have before. And, and maybe they got some skills that they could use. So now they know how to do a pivot table in Excel that they didn't do previously, right? So that's good and certainly better than woo. But, where we get involved mostly because of our work in organizational behavior is at the behavior level. We tend to be in a place where the reason that the company wants to train a bunch of people is that they need behaviors to change. And they need, whether it's change management, they need mindsets and they need people to be open and putting through the change that happens, or whether it's some negative workplace behaviors that they want to change, they want to teach people to be better supervisors because they can have difficult conversations, for example. And so instead of avoiding conversations, they're willing to take them head on. So those types of things. And at this level, they've got to be able to apply that training when they're back on the job. And we need to see a measurable improvement, or we need to see a measurable result. And so that is a much higher level on Kirkpatrick. And this is where we spend the minimum for us is at this level. And then finally, there's level 4, which is results. And here's where you actually change an organizational outcome because of this training. So, and there's a direct tie. You guys are all learning about confounding variables and whatnot. So we are not looking for a world hunger here, but we are looking to, actually make an organizational outcome impact. So for example, if you were doing a sales training, you need to see sales go up because of this training. And it's a very high standard. It's very difficult to achieve. And obviously, we are all aiming at this level because this is where you get a return on investment from your training. You want to make sure that you actually have an organizational outcome that has changed because of this, series of training. Less likely to happen in a single one, but for example, in the example that I just shared about fish and wildlife, we want those behaviors. We want this organization to have more success with external stakeholders because of the skills and the mindset shift that happened in our training session. And we think that has been achieved, although, again, measurement on this is going to also be a longer term thing potentially, because you're not going to walk out of the room and be able to measure this. So now it's, longer term engagement. Are we seeing that the outcomes have shifted because of it? So it tends to be, longer term courses. We do women's leadership development courses that take a year for the course. And through the program, we already see that the women have shifted. So we see the level 3. We then go back and do studies over time to see, has this helped get more women in leadership in the organization? And we have a couple of really big clients for whom we've actually seen that shift, where we've seen an improvement in organizational outcomes of getting more women in leadership because of the fact that they've had this development now that we've been part of. We've been blessed to be part of. So yeah, so this is the Kirkpatrick system. And again, thinking through how your learning outcomes apply and how you're going to assess it is really, really important. And hopefully by thinking of the end, you can go back and make sure that your learning objectives are tailored accordingly. All right, so the final thing is, again, back to this idea of universal design, is to really think through your audience and what special things need to happen in order to make sure that everyone in your audience can participate in the training. So really important, we have had learners in our sessions who are hard of hearing or even deaf. So we've had interpreters, we've brought in interpreters for some of our work. But it's more than just, have an interpreter and continue to stand up there and talk. It's realizing that standing up there and talking there's a very small number of people that actually benefit from lecture. The rest of the folks are missing the information, not listening. You're going to see this because you're going to stand up there on your first day of teaching students and you're going to say something, and 2 seconds later, someone's going to put up their hand and ask you a question that you just answered, right? And that's not their fault. It's just they're different learners. There's different ways of learning, and some people can't, some of you will not have made it through this entire video and heard everything I said, right? So that's just learning. That's just the way it goes. So think about in your design at all times, how can I get to all my learners? And part of it is when you're in the moment, right? Because you're going to be in the moment, you're going to look and you're going to see some eyes closing. And that's going to tell you, that's feedback, especially if it's a lot of eyes closing. Now, I will caveat that with my business partner once. She's also a professor. She was teaching and wondering, why are my students sleeping in my class? And she took a course on engaging, becoming a more engaging speaker, because she was hoping that it would help. And she became a much better speaker by taking the course, but then she noticed that the same number of students are still sleeping. And so at some point, it's not you, it's them. But you got to think about how much of your course are you going to devote to lecturing when you know that only a small portion of people actually learn from lecturing. So think about that. Enjoy. Good luck with your course design. I hope you got something out of this session.